What's going on, workforce? Brian and Chris here, and today we bring you our discussion about the future of Final Fantasy XIV 6.1 and beyond. Where do we see the game going? What are some of the potentials? This should be very light in terms of like spoilers. I wouldn't consider this a spoiler stream. However, all due precaution, if you haven't played through Endwalker, this is obviously going to be like what happens now that Endwalker has been concluded. So you've been lightly warned. Chris, let's kick it to you, man. Now that we've talked about our Endwalker experience, where do we go from here? What do you think is going to happen, and what kind of time frame are we looking at?
So for anybody new, we have historically we have 5 content patches between here and 7.0. Those are roughly 16 weeks apart. And historically, the first 3 would wrap up the expansion. They said that 6.0 would stand alone and the 0.1s would begin the new thing. And then 0.4 and 5 set up the next expansion. So that gives us 5 instead of 2 to set up the next expansion. And that's important because the next expansion is not a continuation. It needs to stand on its own. So it's going to need a little more runway to get up off the ground. Now, we also have an Alliance raid, the Myths of the Realm, a raid series called Pandemonium that are both post-MSQ, pre-7.0, and are both Final Fantasy XIV original content as opposed to the Nier-style crossover event that was in Shadowbringers. To also tell the story, we have Beast Tribes to tell the story. We have role quests. We now have 1 additional role quest for battle jobs. We have the crafting jobs. We have relic quest lines. I would assume we're going to get crafter and gather relics again. So we have a lot. We actually still have a fair bit of content. We may have a deep dungeon, island sanctuary. Like there's a lot here that can each piece can take on its own little bit of world building. To move us forward. But what we don't have is something like World of Warcraft would add zones mid-expansion. Final Fantasy's never done that. So historically,
would you consider the exploratory? I don't know.
I do not. I do not.
Gotcha.
So something like Diadem, Vazja, those things are added, but they are instant zones. They operate in their own rules and all of that. WoW has had things moderately similar, but WoW can just add a whole new zone that we have questing in and people gather in, and much bigger. Imagine the gathering of the current version of Diadem and Vazja and Zadnor taking place. You don't queue in, you just fly there, so there can be any number of people. So there's people just hanging out there. There's botters there because, in any time in those zones, they can be really tedious. And so WoW adds those zones. They're really on theme. They're really of that expansion, so they don't last and linger. But that does mean that to move forward, if we're going to keep this light spoilery, we have to use the zones we have. That's what we have from a storytelling device. So I was really hopeful going into Endwalker that we would have a chance to see what events lead up to the events that cause ARR to unfold, lead up to the issue of why Zodiark was a plan. Because I think a lot of us can see why it was a bad plan, but what set of doors did they have that seemed like the best option was a question I had going into Endwalker. Because I have to assume that they were intelligent people making the best decision available to them. And if that looks like a bad option, they must have had lots of bad options on the table. And I wanted to know what those were. And I think that's still possible as an outcome. I think that's still absolutely somewhere we could go and explore 6.1 and beyond.
It's fascinating because when we look at it, one of the things that I really appreciate and why I'm really excited about the future of Final Fantasy is they're untethered. Where then I would say for the last, 7-8 years specifically, but overall, they've been working on, we're telling the story. We can't just middle of the story just say, you know what, we really want to go do this other thing, oh, and now we really want to go do this other thing. So it's at some point, the fact that they've concluded the story, yes, I don't think the next thing that happens is going to be anything we experienced, because that's something that takes time to build up to. But the nice thing is that if they decide to go some kind of saga again, some kind of hey, we're going to tell a saga over the next 10 years. And in 10 years, people, we're going to do cry counters on the streams again. And, all those kind of things that it's it really frees them up to be you know what, let's just do what we've been wanting to do. We've been looking at our backlog, and even Emmett Selk, kind of teased it. And you kind of called it out already with the Alliance raid, right? It's do you even know the identity of this 12? Well, we know in 6.1 that's happening. So I think you've done a good job of establishing kind of what we know has been pretty much hinted at or discussed, especially with when you take in the past patch cycle content. But what we don't know is, I think, what is about to happen, right? Yoshi P has said a couple different times, just in relation to the servers, hey guys, we're going to give you guys kind of a roadmap to new server, data center, etc. And I think that's the right call, because even if it's 6 months or a year, like, I don't think it's going to be that
more than
long.
Oceanic. He's going to go every region.
Right. And that's what he's discussed, because like we were expecting still 6.1, things can still get delayed. It is, we're all still living in the same world we were living in December. It hasn't changed just because the month is January. But he said a roadmap, because I think that will be really important, because if people are like frustrated, or people keep asking, hey, can I come back? Like I only can play during like the craziest queue times on this one server, because currently server world transfers are also offline. Like some people are just like, it's just easier for me to wait, so we'll have at least a roadmap of saying like, listen, we're going to start to see new servers, new worlds, and that's going to help alleviate some of the congestion that the game is experiencing periodically, depending on where you are. Also, I think from what he's said in the past, with Square Enix is going to spare no expense, and that he's looking forward to sharing kind of this next 10-year journey, I have started to expect that we might see him start to share more about that. The last time he sat down and talked about a roadmap, it was the 2.0 reveal. I don't know if he's going to have something that detailed, but I think if anything else, this next 2 years sets them up to do something insane in 6.0. And so we've been debating that, ad nauseum, like within the Discord, while we just kind of hanging out, and I've been hanging out with people. Here's where the tin hat theory comes into play. Not saying this is going to happen, but man, how wild would it be? Imagine if you still had 14 as it exists today. If you think of that like WoW Classic, right? Where it's like, hey, we've told this story. Here's this game. Guess what? 7.0 comes out or whatever. We're going to let you go up to 99. We've got these systems. And in fact, we've got our development team, all the new people that we're training up in this division. They're going to be the new 14 devs. So they're going to keep updating Final Fantasy 14. But the next main big story saga kicks off, and we're calling that either 17 or whatever they wanted to do. If Yoshi P, based off of Yoshi P's own statement of at some point the number 14 won't make any sense.
New character.
I would think that if they are going to pull it off, like in a way that like the community just really adores it, because Yoshi P's also said the nightmare of trying to move people from one MMO to another MMO, it would be that it was still like, you could call it the soul of our character, and we get, hey, we get reborn 1,000 years later. You and I all have our memories. Turns out all our glamour was attached to our soul. Turns out all those mounts were attached to our soul. Why the hell not? And thus essentially you have that a relationship. In fact, even your friends list and your free company and like all of these things, you're just attached. So just like within Phantasy Star, you could go to, timeline A and timeline B. I think that what they've done, it actually affords them the ability to do something that insane when we start talking about what like another 10 years of Final Fantasy 14 could be. And it's like, they could really do anything they want. And whether it ended up being a different engine or not, my concern would be something what we saw WoW address eventually with the level squish. My concern is that now that we finished a stat squish, at some point they're going to be like, yeah, level 130 is kind of tough. Maybe we'll just zip that on back down to like level 60 or something like that. And that's,
I thought WoW's level squish was really brilliant.
It helped me as a new player. Like it made it less intimidating. However, at the same time, if all of a sudden it's like you clawed those levels that I've got, we got 90 going back to 60. I don't think it doesn't initially like say yes, even though I get the fundamental game design, I get the logic, and I get how it impacted me in a positive way. As a veteran, I don't want to see that.
So, I mean, first of all, like WoW is a game where leveling alts is a fairly typical thing. So, like, it's not just about what it does to your current characters. You are always somebody, even as a veteran, who could be having a new character experience. If they add a new class to the game, that affects that.
Yeah.
But what WoW talked about, what Ian talked about with that stat squish, I mean, WoW has had plenty of mistakes over the last several years, but I don't think the level squish is one of them. And what they talked about was that WoW was based on being a D&D exploration into an RTS world they had established, right? And so you're supposed to be able to take this character into this existing world, and it has all of the lore and flash and pizzazz of an RTS. And and be like, wow, it's not nearly as good as this narrative based game I played from Final Fantasy. Yeah. Like it was an RTS. And so what he talked about was when you go through D&D and you level it, you get to the end of your night. I don't think have you had a chance to play D&D, Brian? And so when you get to the end of a role-playing game evening, Pathfinder, D&D, any of those systems, what will end up happening, what will end a session, what is very, very typically the end of a session, is your dungeon master will dole out the experience from completing your quest for the session, and that will naturally, if they have paced it, might be a moment where you level and you hit that level up. And the reason that happens at the end of your session is that there is all this stuff that happens. You might have to, depending on the game system, have to roll dice to determine what stat weights go up. You might have to choose from a series of things like, oh, I have a couple spells available and I get to pick one. And so there's all this reading that takes place where you're given homework to prepare for the following week. Depending on your dungeon master, they may say, hey, I even need that back before the next session, so I know what you all chose. And so there's this homework portion that takes place, sometimes individually, sometimes as a group, but it is a bookkeeping aspect of these games, and it makes that level feel significant. What it is not is mid-session, you completed the quest, here is your level. Okay, that doesn't really matter. Let's move to the next quest. And it's just this arbitrary number moving up that just denotes that time has passed. As they continued to bolt on levels to these games, it started to feel like, okay, well, to keep it meaningful, it has to be eternally long. To keep it reasonable for getting through, it has to be so short that it's not meaningful. We're going to have the same issue with story in Final Fantasy XIV. So to compare to a level squish to WoW, I would say the most similar parallel within 14 is the length of our story. Our story is going to get longer and longer and longer. So they're either going to have to go back and cut more things out to get people through more and more abridged versions, because new players or alternate characters are going to be told you have to clear 1,000 hours before you're allowed to enter Pandemonium, and it's 1,500 hours before you can enter, Z2S or whatever we're going into in whatever expansion. Or you have to you have to shorten it up so it's not meaningful, or you have to lengthen it. So I would say that story is the most similar parallel. And it would feel just as much like, I don't want it taken away, but I also don't want it to be this mandatory requirement.
At some point in another 10 years, like how much, and we've been talking about this since Stormblood. It's like at some point, like how, like what's that jump? And that's why, like, I think like we'll just say 7.0 for the sake of just easy math and time frames. I think 7.0 would be a perfect time to actually say, this is a brand new starting point. Like you can make a new character and you can start your journey right at this point. In fact, I think people have asked Yoshi P about this in interviews saying, hey, would you ever think about doing a story so far, or like some way of like encompassing 1.0 all the way to Endwalker? And that he said, yeah, I think he just kind of mumbled, or, it's like, oh, like that'd be a lot of work. But like, I think that's essentially where, like, if they decided to take that route where 7.0 ended up becoming like, hey, welcome to Saga 2, 14 edition or whatever, this is a great place for brand new players to come in. And then guess what? We got New Game Plus already established. So if you do want to go jump in and experience kind of that line in the sand, you can kind of have that kind of pre and post. And the question is it accompanied with a time shift? Is it accompanied with like an engine update? I've seen people speculate that, and honestly, like from a time perspective, it could, they've got 2 years presumably until the next expansion. And if they've been already working on this plan for a while, that does alleviate a lot of pressure in time. But,
okay. So let's follow that line of thought.
Yeah.
So Yoshi P said, he did say in an interview, he was asked, what happens? Do we just jump into a new space and time? And he said, I'm not just going to pick you up and jump you off in a world with none of your past relationships.
Right.
Moving forward will be a continuation of your character, and the relationships that you've had along the way will matter. So that is something he stated prior to us ever having played Endwalker. I believe it was in an interview with Jesse Cox and JP. And so that is something he said. We know that. So I have seen a number of people say, okay, well then 6.1 is the logical on-ramp narratively, right? 7.0 is the logical on-ramp narratively. And then you give people the option through New Game Plus and things like that to say, hey, we're going to sum people up. So the first time insert X character here walks onto the screen in 7.0, they walk in, and instead of saying, hey, old friend, and you just jump into it like we have throughout the expansions, which is why it's so hard for story skippers to get back on the horse, you stop and you say, it's been so long, Brian, my engineer friend, how are your kids? I know you have kids. It's really interesting that you live in Texas. And you say all of this, and veteran players are like, yeah, it's good to catch up. But new players are like, okay, I just learned all of this through the forms of like epithets, adjectives, all this other stuff that can be descriptive in the first time we meet somebody. But that's not the only problem here. You have to catch people up, because in theory, the reason people don't like level boosters, in theory, the game has also taught you what a stack marker is. The game has also taught you what a damage down is.
Right.
In theory, you've been learned to manage your inventory. You have an armory system. You've unlocked other jobs. You've done all these things. So it's not just about narratively does it make sense. There is a game mechanically underneath this that you will have never done anything. How does your UI work and all of this? And honestly, the one we'd be throwing out is not perfect. So it would also be an opportunity to just make a better one. Yoshipi's talked about in an interview with, I think, Afro Sinji, no, maybe Eduardo and Annie. He talked about like, hey, are you proud of ARR? And he said, yeah, we're very proud of ARR. We love ARR. That being said, if we knew then everything we know now, if we had the resources then that we have now, if we had the experience and the development talents and the broadness that we do now back then, we would have made a better game.
Yeah.
So like, if we had the time, we'd love to go back and make a better ARR.
Yeah.
When? And so that would be the opportunity to say, okay, 7.0 is not only a narrative reset, and 6.1 through 5 is the precursors.
Yeah, just building up, finishing off, and like, just like doing the tour of your, Spotify 2021 playlist. Like, we've done this, we've established this,
Absolutely.
we've kind of finished the thought. But then essentially, like when going back to the words of MXL, like we haven't been in the New World, we haven't been in Meracidia, and oh, have we not seen the reflections? Some would blow your mind. And to a point where, imagine if a new player literally started on a reflection and then essentially was then brought in through, like, what WoW ended up doing, where it's like, hey, we're going to do this, we're going to kind of tell this story in this kind of isolated place. We're going to teach you about stack markers through your new experience. And then all of a sudden you get pushed into kind of I guess a normalized meeting point, or heck, that ends up being like, guess what? We're going to the first, and they don't use levels there. They use bevels or something, and all of a sudden you have a whole different progression system that's wrapped up with whatever is this new starting point, both narratively, but also with that. And then all of a sudden you step back into the current version and you still have all of your stuff, right? Like, I'm not sitting here like saying, and everybody gets put back to level 1. But at some point, like if they do have a new narrative, like it can, in my mind, be accompanied with a new progression style system. So you don't end up having to sit here and try to manage of like, oh, you have this level 1 player and then this level 99 player, and they're coming together, and all of a sudden it's like, okay, we got problems.
Right.
You
could even go bigger, right? Because the problem is, how do you justify the resources? WoW tried to hide resources once in Cataclysm, where they said, hey, we're going to do a bunch of stuff, and we're going to re-rate it, make old zones, and then we're going to write a story that has a reason to take us into those old zones. You could say, okay, and then simultaneously, alongside 6.1 through 5, we're going to design a dumbed-down version of that. You're going to be going through the early days of the Mists of the Realm, or you're going to be going through the closing days of Alec, or something like that, something we've never done.
Yeah.
And it's going to be a shortened story of the closing days of Alec. And at the end, you're going to be launched into the beginning of 7.0. And then veteran players are like, well, how do I do that? And so they're going and new gaming plusing the new player experience because they're excited to get to play through a 5 hour, what is the last 5 hours of Alec like?
Yeah.
What are those like? And they just design that as this really cool thing. It's got all sorts of little side NPCs that reveal all sorts of lore, whatever they don't plan on ever addressing, right?
Yeah.
Are they ever going to take us to Corvos? Are they ever going to take us to Meracidia? Make a starting zone out of one of those. You don't have to make those. You don't have to spin up a whole new shard. You could just pick one of the places we've never been and just give us 5 hours there.
Yeah.
And that can just be the new player experience. And that catches them up. And all the people there can tell stories of, yeah, here in Mericidia, oh my gosh, have you ever heard the story of? And then just insert whatever you want people to know from now as a 2-paragraph summary. And then if people are like, man, I really wish that'd been longer. Well, do I have great news for you? You can go New Game Plus, the full version.
Like, how was Mericidia impacted by the final days? How was the New World impacted by the final days? Like, how was all these things and et cetera? And it gives, the thing is, it goes back to my original point. Like, whatever they end up doing, like, I think it's the most exciting time to be a Final Fantasy 14 player because they're not bound by the narrative, you know, that the narrative they built themselves, right? And I thought they did an excellent job, but the laws were the laws of which they put into place. And it's like, okay, we started this journey. It's important for a good story to end the journey. And I think they've definitely set themselves up with some interesting threads for the future. But I think that it's like, this is the best part about it. It's like, great. We don't have to worry about these characters. We don't have to worry about like, okay, well, how would they respond? Or the players going like, well, wait, whatever happened to this character that was like really important? And then all of a sudden we never saw from again. It's like, no. They've addressed all that. This is like, let's talk about new characters, new stories. And also, like, I think from a narrative perspective, I think if anything else, like when you look at some of the lines that were said, some of the truths that were said, even, Alphano talked about that in his letter. Like, now that there isn't this massive threat that's uniting us, how soon as the various races, the various city states, the various like cultures start turning on each other over competition for X, Y, and Z resource? Like, how long does this peace last before, you know, the threat might not be, you know, otherworldly? It literally just might be,
as soon as you take a side quest, right? I don't know if you've done any side quests as you were going through like MSQ or whatever, but it's jarring. I did one in Thavnair. I did one in the middle of MSQ in Thavnair. I did a side quest to like ding the next level.
Nice.
And they were like, I need you to help me set up my birthday party. And you're like, really? Now?
This minute?
Yeah.
I got to really cheer myself up. Got to really cheer myself up.
I need to talk about what the word urgent means.
Yeah, exactly. So, guys, I would love to know what you guys are looking forward to or expecting. Obviously, I think January is going to be an interesting month because we do know some updates from Yoshi P are coming. And we do know 6.1 is at some point, right, you know, is going to probably be right around the corner. So we will actually start expecting to see some new live letters kind of spin up probably here in the next week or two. At least we'll have some dates. And so we'll look forward to kind of covering those with you guys, react with you guys. So it's going to be a fun 2022. Welcome and Happy New Year. Chris, why don't you take us out?
There's going to be a lot of speculation in the weeks to come. We know we're getting 2 live letters typically between now and 6.1, but he has a roadmap he wants to share. Do we get more? Do we get less? We don't know. But congratulations to TPS on the world first. The world first race was amazing. It was very fun to get to watch. Bummed that nobody in day one got through on stream, but there were 3 teams that got through. Congratulations to each of you. And hopefully you guys are all enjoying Final Fantasy 14. We are in for a great 2022. We'll see you next time.
Take care.